It's a great mistake because it's actually letting a lot of people off the hook. And fortunately, Edwin Black stepped up to the plate, who's obviously um, livid with the people who profited from the exploitation of his parents during World War II, who were obviously enslaved Jews in the Hitlerian machine. And he's dealing with it. He's written a book called Nazi Nexus. He's written this book, which was a blockbuster. It's called IBM and the Holocaust by Edwin Black, who deals with IBM, who helped with the computerization of the slave labor and concentration camps. And so this is something that I think it's very brave and courageous of Professor Hall to deal with, because in the academy certain issues are taboo and certain issues there is this kind of nudge nudge wink wink, you shouldn't go there, but he does go there, along with many other issues which I'll get to later when discussing the latter part of this chapter. So that's all I'll say about the second part of the chapter. And I'm now on to the third part of the chapter, which is entitled Wars on Indians, Slavs, Jews, Communists, and the Truth in the Genesis of the Military-Industrial Complex. And so if you have a copy of the book and you're watching this later on, it will be around page 238, this part, 238. Professor Hall draws some interesting analogies between the United States and between Nazi Germany. You notice he lumps together Indians and Slavs and Jews. So how can he justify and qualify this? Well, he gives a preamble with some interesting history into how the United States, that kind of part of Anglo-America, took over from the British Empire with the kind of Monroe Doctrine of 1823, where they basically said that European powers could kind of get lost from the American hemisphere. That was their purview. So you see, for example, Britain gave up Hawaii to the United States in the 1890s, and they became increasingly more expansionist and took over from Spanish Empire after the Spanish-American War in 1898, Cuba, the Philippines, and so on. And so you start to see the American empire emerge, the informal empire building of the American empire. Its tentacles begin to spread, and that's why you have people like Jose Marti and so on rising up against that phenomenon. So in this part of the chapter, Professor Hall goes into the connections, continues discussing the connections between certain members of the US elite and Nazi Germany, the Nazi state, the fascist state, and fascist Italy, and so on. One of these individuals was a Charles Lindbergh. Charles Lindbergh, of course, was the famous aviator, the famous guy who flew across the Atlantic, the first person to fly across the Atlantic. And he was a prominent fascist and white supremacist. He famously said, "We, the heirs of the European culture, are on the verge of a disastrous war, a war within our own family of nations, a war which would reduce the strength and destroy the treasures of the white race. The white race is bound to lose, and others are bound to gain. A war which may easily lead our civilization through more dark ages if it survives at all." So Hall writes, for Lindbergh, the alternative to war with the Nazis was a grand alliance of Western nations to preserve the ruling imperative of the white race. He proposed an English fleet, a German air force, a French army, an American nation standing together as guardians of our common heritage. So you can see how certain people would have had a kind of mindset of, well, what Hitler's doing isn't actually that radical, like you can sort of imagine how some people would have been of the mindset, well, Hitler's fighting communism. Hitler's fine, and you have these. Some people would have been cognizant, I expect, of the kind of war profiteer factions who wanted to see Europe destroy itself, and of course that's what we saw. What played out, and so while Hall, and I'd agree with him, supports the Churchillian war against the Nazis, because in hindsight, knowing what we know, so you can see how the alternative of letting the Nazis have a carte blanche and to have their way would have been even more disastrous than what we've had to deal with. Although on the other hand, you can see how this idea of the Wall Street bankers and the oligarchy getting Europe to destroy itself, the way they got Iran and Iraq to destroy itself, the way they're going to get Pakistan and India to destroy themselves. This way you kind of divide and rule between nations and have wars which A, profits you, and then B, you go in with after the kind of shock doctrine, and you then play a prominent role in the reconstruction, like we saw with the Marshall Plan after World War II. So some would allege you kind of had the USA making Europeans kill each other and destroy themselves, pulling the strings of these radical, fanatical leaders, fascist leaders, and so on. Once they destroyed themselves, coming in and making the whole of Western Europe a kind of colony of the United States. And that's a kind of what did happen. And it's kind of a moral judgment of whether, we would have been better off with an alternative. And I think it would be pretty hard to make that case. But despite the kind of misanthropy and the, disastrousness of US imperialism for the planet, certainly Hitlerian imperialism, Nazi imperialism, wouldn't have been any better. And so it's an interesting debate to contemplate, though, I think, because even just to have this discussion and just to air these issues and say, well, you did have, they're linked, they're interwoven, they're not, and so this idea that you have this Madison Avenue depiction of Hitler, it doesn't do justice to the reality. And the reality was Hitler was a man. He was a politician. He had bigoted and racist and repugnant views. But Nazi Germany was the industrialists. It was the war profiteers. It was the oligarchy who transcended nation states, the international oligarchy who basically profited from and orchestrated World War II and World War I and the interlude. And so dealing with that is an important way to kind of understand where we are today, understand how we view the United States, where it came from, where we are today, what's its past, what's its history. And when you hear people throw around the word like, oh, we're living in fascism today, when you kind of understand it through this paradigm and through this window into history, it's not all that radical to contemplate. And how would fascism be in 2010? Well, when I look at the privatized prisons, the prison industrial complex, when I look at the global war on terror, when I look at drones that are operated by geeks with remote controls going into Afghan villages, when I look at Guantanamo Bay and the psychological warfare, the dehumanization of Muslims, just as the fascist state was adept at dehumanizing certain populations like Jewish people and Slavic people and gypsies and so on, creating an other for the body politic to define itself against. Using the word fascism isn't all that outlandish, and I think it's important to understand that. And to understand that, you have to understand these private-public partnerships, these corporate state alliances, which Hitler was the kind of signatory to, but was basically a puppet of. And you can see in a Preparator's picture, there's kind of Hitler with his hand with puppet strings on it. So, and this is a very mainstream, peer-reviewed, interesting text. But so returning to Professor Hall, so he's dealt with that, and he then segues into Henry Ford, the phenomenon of Henry Ford, who disseminated anti-Semitic propaganda left, right, and center, who rekindled revived and rebranded the text, the disgusting text of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, disseminated that throughout the world, and he received awards from Hitler. Hitler had a picture of Henry Ford on his office wall. So when you think today, like the role of Ford motor cars, I always find it ironic whenever I get a text at universities, and it's from the States, and you open the first page and it's like, I'd like to thank the Ford Foundation, I'd like to thank the Rockefeller Foundation. There was one also the other day in a book I read by Bourgeois called In Search of Respect, a guy who'd done an ethnography in El Barrio in New York, and he began by talking about his father's experience in World War II as a Jew, and I believe in one of the concentration camps. But then I turned to the acknowledgements, and he's acknowledging the Ford Foundation. So the ignorance of this history, once you realize it and once you kind of have done your reading on it, done your homework on it, it makes you view everything a little bit differently. And certainly the Henry Ford and Ford Motor Company owes a great deal of its profits to anti-Semitism, to racism, and to fascism.